Ja, Thema Sicherheit auf Messen. Ich sag vielleicht noch
Safety at trade shows, safety at fairs. I currently have the pleasure to advise to a fair in Leipzig, which is going to host a trade championship, and I am going to actually be the event manager. So I am going to be at the forefront, and I am going to decide on what is possible and what is not possible. And I've had the honor of managing a seemingly uncritical fair, which turned out to be quite critical because it was a fair at which China was a special guest, and there were demonstrators in favor and against to be handled. So there were quite some critical safety issues to be considered. Now, what if you had to decide what was the biggest risk on this site today, at an event like the one today? Is it papal pressure? Is it evacuation? Where are the risks at an event like this? A couple of months ago, I was provided with the files on a criminal proceedings on event safety where 19 people had suffered spotlight burns of the 3rd degree that had been put up outside during the European Song Contest. And 19 people suffered burns in their faces, burns of the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd degree. This was 2 years ago, and I was presented with the files, and those responsible for the event technology were mentioned in prominent places of these files. So, as a result, the public prosecutor said, well, you are responsible for the event technology, so you are responsible for what happened to these people who were so badly injured. Sometimes you lose sight of the details. Of course, a hall can be full of people in a trade show like this. If, for instance, at a music trade show, a well-known musician turns up and he tries out his guitar, and everybody takes out their mobile phones and tells the other visitors, hey, come over to this hall, Bruce Springsteen is acting on the stage. Well, all of a sudden you have people crowding into this hall, and then, of course, you may have incidents like the spotlights coming down because so many people are crushing towards them. So who is responsible for an incident like that? Is it the people from Messe Frankfurt? Or what about a guest event like the trade show for books, for automotive technology, etc.? Well, who is responsible? Responsible is the operator, like a limited company operating this building, this company. It is their management, and they, of course, can assign certain obligations to an organizer. So this can be transferred in writing, but whatever has not been transferred in writing remains in the responsibility of the operator. So if you want to delimit responsibilities between those operating the building, enabling events to take place on their premises, they are the ones who are primarily responsible. There is the so-called model regulation governing assemblies in the individual states of Germany, and they basically stipulate that you are responsible for any incident occurring on your premises if you are the operator, unless you have transferred responsibility in writing. If the legislator talks about safety In the trade show area, this has to do with operators. Like the owner of a car is responsible for the car being parked in the wrong place and not the person who drove the car by coincidence. But there are some unclear cases, and in those cases you have to look at the guarantee position or guarantor position. And in order to make this quite clear, I have come up with this slide. Who is the operator and who is the organizer? Well, the operator is the one who has an economic interest and who has decisive influence on whether or not the premises will be let to a tenant or lessee. So in our case, it would be Messe Frankfurt, because they decide whether or not to let or rent out their premises to an event organizer. Now, who's an organizer? An organizer, is that somebody who invites people to an event informally on Facebook? Here we have questions of responsibility if the police has to step in the end. Now, here we have to ask ourselves the decisive question whether or not responsibility has been assigned. In criminal law, there is a special assignment of responsibility to an organizer responsible for hosting a specific event. For instance, Messe Frankfurt is not responsible for each and every stall on a trade show. It is the organizer who is responsible. And the organizer can, in turn, assign part of the responsibility to the stand operators and the trade show equipment providers, because they have to adhere to rules and regulations governing the structures on trade shows. For instance, they have to make sure that UV covers are installed in the relevant places. So typically the exhibitors are not organizers. They are tenants or lessees with a view to the organizers. So certain parts of responsibility have been assigned to the organizer, and there are at least 3 parties involved: the operators, the organizers, and the exhibitors. Now, who's responsible for keeping the aisles between the trade fair stands clear? Who is responsible for what during the installation phase? Who takes care of what areas of operations? You should actually note this down in writing and very exactly. It should not just be shouted out. It should not just be an oral agreement. The guarantor status is guaranteed by specific agreements, life partnerships, etc. They can also be the foundation of a guarantor status. Sometimes you can also be held as the guarantor of any misbehavior of third parties. But, as I've said before, the original guarantor can transfer responsibilities to other parties in writing. But then the question is, do you have a competent or a non-competent organizer? For certain authorities, and in the context of risk assessments, it is absolutely vital whether or not an organizer is deemed reliable or unreliable. So it also has to do with reputation of the organizer. Sometimes if an organizer is deemed irresponsible, the standards and requirements placed on the security staff and the security preconditions are much higher. If, for instance, I have a Russian Swan Lake ballot staging, I have to look at the security precautions in a different way because of the language barrier, because of the cultural barrier, etc. Here I have brought the court ruling concerning the Allianz Arena event, where a greenkeeper lost his hearing due to pyrotechnical nonsense that someone from the audience started. Now, the question was, will I be held responsible for illegal behavior of third parties, such as members of the audience? For instance, if people climb up on the ceiling and then they drop down on the people who are sitting down there. Sometimes they do that during shareholders' meetings. They just want to unroll a poster and then they drop down and cause an accident. Or think of Campino and the Tote Hosen band. Bengal fires are burned, pyrotechnics is burned. Well, what caused this incident to occur in the first place? Well, Campino actually told people or encouraged people burning pyrotechnical stuff. And Campino once said, "I'm going to play the next song for you." So at the next concert, 8 people started burning off fireworks. And I called my colleagues from the Trade Fair Frankfurt and I told them, Campino will be in your venue in 3 days' time, so make sure that people don't bring pyrotechnics in. Here the question is, do I need more security people? Don't I need more security people? Legislation tell me that I have to control and check on people to a reasonable extent. But what is a reasonable extent? And if I am mistaken here, I might be held responsible from a civil law perspective. Recent court rulings of the Federal Court of Justice said that you have to apply your diligence and duty of care, and your responsibility as a guarantor will be measured by this. Now, who is ultimately responsible for a specific measure? When I read those criminal proceedings documents that I told you about from the people burnt in their faces, I thought differently about several things. A project manager who is not even present can be sued criminally for negligent injury because a step had not been lighted properly. The light had been dimmed. An elderly lady stumbled and fell, and she had to spend 1 year at hospital, and her lawyers sued the project manager. And the project manager was subject to criminal proceedings, and he was told, well, in the dark, you would have to at least light up the stairs so people could see them if you dim the general hall light. So who is responsible in the context of their roles and functions? From a liability point of view, this is quite an interesting question. Next, what is the purpose of the legislator if they stipulate that the event manager must be present at all times? At the trade show, we've had many discussions. Who is the event manager? Who is the crisis committee? Who is the emergency committee? Very often, authorities want to have one point of contact. They actually note down the name of the person they are going to hold responsible. But they only do this in Stuttgart. They don't have it in Frankfurt or Stuttgart, in Frankfurt or Düsseldorf. Some authorities really want to have one person they can get in touch with if, for instance, a rescue access route is blocked during the installation phase. And this is, of course, very bad. If you're an exhibitor, you know what the hall looks like during the installation and build-up phase. But of course, even the trade show landscape has changed here. We know that even during the installation phase, people must be able to get out of the hall in case of an emergency. Think of the Euro pallet dimensions. They are typically the parameter for dimensioning the aisles. Safety at trade shows begins here. You really have to make sure that 1 meters and 20 centimeters is the minimum clearance. And what they do at the individual stands can be widely left up to them. The event is supported by many parties. Some of them are very responsible and very conscientious, and others are less so. When it comes to football, we've had this issue with the first and second league at the Allianz Arena. And actually, the clubs very often name their secretaries as event managers. This is a situation that cannot be tolerated. Why do they say the secretary is responsible? Well, her boss says, I have to take care of the VIP guests. I cannot be present as the event manager. But these are things that you have to consider when drawing up a safety concept. Generally speaking, we have to make sure, and I have seen a written document in this house here, at Messe Frankfurt, we have a 24/7 center staffed with people who do nothing but taking care of safety issues. This is much better than just having one person singling him or her out and saying, you are responsible for safety at this event. Very often, if you have a crisis committee, there is a diversity of opinions within this committee. Sometimes people do not agree on what to do. And I remember we had one event where a bomb threat came in, and the police and other members of the committee could not agree on whether to take this bomb threat seriously. So we found a solution for such a scenario. If, for instance, at the sports studio the tent is burning, we just evacuate the tent. There is no crisis scenario anymore. Or if there is a thunderstorm raining down on this tent, we have 20 minutes in order to evacuate people to safe places. And we observed the weather radar, and we decided that this is the right point in time to get people out of this tent. And when it comes to the outdoor area of this trade fair, you have to ask yourself the question, what about the people who are on those outdoor areas? The halls are full anyway, and say at the automotive trade show you have the Ferrari and the Maserati halls. Everybody wants to go there anyway, and the halls are crammed. So you really have to block these halls under certain conditions, and this is something that you have to consider in cases when the outdoor areas have to be cleared. You have to be sensitive to all kinds of scenarios. For instance, in Munich, if there is the October Festival, they block all the underground train stations because whenever there is rain threatening, people will try to move into the underground train stations, and they will actually push each other onto the trucks because there will simply be too many people there. So whenever rain threatens, they block the underground railway stations. Or think of major concerts with celebrities picking their guitars. You really have to consider safety questions from this particular point of view. You need to have wider escape routes. You need to have wider escape doors at large concert or football venues than you need them at a, say, technical trade show. Next, you have to think about what happens if more people are in the hall than there should actually be. You cannot have people standing up at the doors counting all the people walking in and out of the hall. You'd need automatic detectors as well as people standing there, and then you would have to have a coordination center determining whether more people are allowed to walk into the room. Well, we always go by feeling and visual impression, don't we? We cannot count the people walking through a trade show hall. That would simply be uneconomic. And actually, this is quite acceptable, I think, because the risk of a trade show hall being overcrowded is manageable. You can always act on that. Emergency organization. There are different solutions that trade show companies have found to this situation. I know many of them throughout Germany. Typically, there is a technical event management, a project side management. Now, what if these two management teams cannot agree on how to act in a specific situation? Well, there is a crisis team and an emergency team, and it is always important to clearly delineate competencies and responsibilities. Why? Think of the well-known court ruling on I.Br. There was a recall that should have been uttered. It was a leather spray that people used to spray their shoes or leather jackets, and the people used the spray and they got lung edema. And the I.Br company's management decided not to launch a recall because they said, we cannot afford this. It would be so much negative publicity. And the public prosecutor, in the end, said that the management had failed to contribute to making the recall. So the management was collectively responsible for withholding the recall. And actually, the court ruled according to the prosecutor's plea. Take an event like this. If a bomb threat call came in, do you think that the police would really decide to evacuate the entire trade show premises? No, they wouldn't. It must be a coordinated decision, and several people would have to take part in this. Or think of Dr. Ackermann. Whenever there was a major meeting of Deutsche Bank, there were bomb threats or other threatening calls, but the risk of them coming true was rather low because the entire building had been searched for explosives before. So typically, it's not up to the police to take such a decision. You always need somebody on the event management side to take this decision. I don't know whether there are colleagues from the Düsseldorf trade show here today. Remember when ZDF transmitted this bet where a young man got hurt when jumping across a car? It was not the Düsseldorf trade show that discontinued the event. It was ZDF, the German television station, that decided to discontinue the event. So in such cases where people are hurt, it is always up to the event organizer to discontinue the event. Whenever there is just a technical disturbance, however, it's up to the event host or operator to discontinue the event, because they are the ones to decide whether their equipment technology is still working, up and running. So it's not up to the event manager to decide on that, it is the operator to decide on that. For a bomb threat, it is a different story. Whenever there is a bomb threat, it's up to you in agreement with the police, or else I will leave it up to you. I will say, ladies and gentlemen, it's up to you to decide whether or not you evacuate the building. So ultimately, it's up to the event manager.
Kommen immer mehr Anfragen von
I'm getting a lot of questions coming from financial authorities, from banks. They say, okay, we go into big halls and now we are going to appoint an event manager as a guest, but they don't really tell us what to do. And that is basically what our job is. And then basically, I think, especially also in the fair companies and the conference center companies, there is some catching up to do. If you say you want to appoint somebody as an event manager, then you have to support these people. You have to tell these people, you know, how your systems are working, how can that person be involved. So therefore, you might actually want to do a lot of things. There might actually be a lot of problems if you don't get this right. So what I did on this chart, I tried to answer a question I was just asked. You know, there's 6 components really about safety and security concepts of trade fair. So that starts totally differently than, say, a football match. And that starts really to start with. It's really about quality. It's really about security quality. You really have to define what somebody is allowed to bring in. And that is what all the trade companies, the fair trade companies actually do. And they actually say, okay, that is what you're allowed to put up. And they also give you, you know, what is happening if you don't install this rightly. So basically, they usually get their liabilities straight, their penalties right, and the intervention right. And we heard about a lot of very, very severe penalties at trade fairs in Moscow. So especially they take pictures of all foods that are being made during the installation point, and that is what the operator does. And then in the contract with the exhibitor, it says, okay, if you just go up the last step on the ladder, that costs between 500 and 1,000 euros. So basically, you get your invoice for all kinds of things you didn't do right during the setup. So that might actually be an educational process. You know, he just gets a documentation of the photos. He gets the stand with his number. Then he's obviously getting a bill. And apparently, an installer, John Deere, you know, they actually produce special cars, and in the end, I think that was about 35,000 additional euros and costs, which was amazing. So that is basically where it kicks in. It's about technical regulations, and it's really about design concepts, planning, etc. That is what the operator of an event does. So what about the concept? What about evening events? What is the planning like? What is the design like? So again and again, we are faced with the situation where people ask you, how can visitors be protected from whatever kind of movement? I mentioned the World Skills, you know, at the city of Leipzig's trade fair, and basically what they do, there's that craft fair, there's 10,000 participants, I think, there's that championship, and they try to find out who is the world's best welder, and they do that with a lot of people around them, and then there might be a stone mason. I mean, they are just going to blow up stones. So basically they make requirements towards a fair that is no longer a fair, but it's basically a live show, and then you basically have to come up with a definition of the risk, and then you want to make sure that you're going to be safe, that nobody is going to be insured. And then it's really about the event manager and the operator to get this straight. So basically, you have to do your risk assessment in terms of what is being done. If you have something like today, you have a lot of Israeli exhibitors, then usually you have to have a different security concept for that kind of set, for those stands, as a rule. Then you have a couple of issues, you know, products, and then you have to make sure, okay, you want to make sure that no suitcase is being put near that stand that doesn't belong there. So there's a lot of individual assessments that you have to undertake. And what happens in terms of the security organization? What about controls and steering approaches during the assembly installation? There was a couple of stands that were just breaking down. And then it was just unfortunate. There might have been a person that was just below that. Maybe there was a fatal accident, somebody died or somebody's being injured. And then that is a big thing, because next day it's going to be all about that detective story and the fair is not going to open up. And then it comes also to the economic level and also self-supporting stands which are not properly fixed, that are not properly connected and all that. How is that kind of thing happening? A door opens that should never have been open, so things that just happen. I mean, we know these things happen. We know that. However, more and more companies, more and more event organizations make sure that these things no longer happen. And then at another fair, we had something like that. We're no longer allowed to smoke when we actually set up. So what is happening? You know, at the ashtrays, they just put them outside of the gates. And people were just pressing the gates, and then apparently there was like 5, 6 kind of effect, especially in that situation when there's a draft, because another gate was already open. So it's all about experiences. I mean, things like that happen, should not happen, but then you have to kick back in with the organization. So up to a certain point, you can manage that kind of thing. And in the end, it is really, you can plan whatever you want. You can try to be as safe as you can. And I usually try to call that, you know, be free from dangers of all kinds of acceptable and permissible residual risk that is always around. There's thunderstorms out there. That could be technical fatigue of a kind of transverse thing that comes down. Things like that always happen. And then when things like that happen, you have to make sure, and we've seen some very impressive pictures also from Graz, you have to make sure you can evacuate people quickly. But obviously cultural events, I mean, you can't really run that kind of thing having enough people in there. Security staff, I've seen that, like 50 security staff for a classical music concert that was actually from the office of the internal music. I went to a classical music thing up in Bonn, and I think they only had nice hostesses, and they don't really cost the same amount like a 50 kind of a core staff unit of people that might potentially help in evacuations. You mentioned the cloakrooms. The cloakrooms, that is no longer a problem, because you're going to be elsewhere. You're going to be in a totally different place from where your cloakroom is. You wouldn't be running back all the way to get your cloakroom. So to block a cloakroom at trade fairs usually is not a problem. However, if you actually host a conference here at the same facility, then I'd actually recommend to actually say straight away, ladies and gentlemen, we are very, very sorry. There's a fire or there's a bomb threat or whatever. So we have to make sure we evacuate you very, very quickly. Don't worry, there's no reason to be upset. However, the cloakrooms will be blocked. So we will tell you what is going to happen as soon as we can. So you have that individual announcement of an emergency. I think you need to tell people that you are not going to give out your codes, because otherwise people are going to queue up. I heard from clients, you know, they heard that kind of cloakrooms were actually emptied in a very, very small hall. They're just going to jump all over that, and they are very, very upset, you know, all these ladies with their beautiful coats. So let's take a look at that. So intervention. So what are these? These rights to intervene. And you start very, very early on. You have to plan safe. You have to plan safe. You have to organize things in a safe way. And then usually I say you can only run an event or a fair and provided that there are no faults, and that is very, very clear. So the operator, also the event manager, they are saying, okay, we do random checks at all stands, have they set up everything all right? If we actually figure out that is not going to happen, then we close off the stand. And that is what needs to happen, because obviously the operator has the secondary obligation to check that everything is fine. So, okay, what about stand safeties? That is something that comes from the Assembly Act, and you can actually transfer that to an exhibitor or to an operator. It is really about mobile constructions, and that actually says you must make sure that there's no dynamic vibrations that can impact these kind of mobile constructions. And then a couple of facilities already had some loads, kilonewtons in terms of square meters. That is what is actually contained in the regulations. However, if you have that kind of trade fair, actually do the Hansetage in Herford, 300,000 people, that is what they expect. 60,000 people, that is the population of the town of Herford. Obviously, they don't really come one day. It's 4 or 5 days. So what you actually do with mobile constructions, if you have a lot of people coming in, you know there's going to be a lot of pressure in the halls. There's going to be a lot of pressure in individual sections. So you want to make sure that the installation process is fine in terms of static. So because, there's a lot of people, they might be pressed against a mobile construction. So you want to make sure that stand is not coming down, because that might cause a panic. And you've seen that kind of information beforehand. So you want to make sure that your safety and security concepts are taking this into account. So you really have to match them against the individual risk at the site. So what about football? So we're seeing that at the moment. So we basically have a classification of risks. So that is, on the one hand, it is the audience. We've seen that at 2 trade fair companies for the planning phase. So I've had the pleasure to also do ILA this year. That is a big aviation fair. And obviously that is the company that doesn't open up the airport in Berlin. So it's very, very hard to basically get to agreements. And we were actually taking a look at that kind of thing. How can we get this organized with ILA? And then we used the same process. So basically, we put a lot of individual sheets next to the individual risks. So we wanted to know, are there any risks related to the audience? And ILA, that obviously is an aviation fair. And then it was very much about the spotters. The spotters that don't actually buy an entrance ticket, that would just be queuing around the fence. And then it says in air traffic control regulations that aircrafts are not allowed to take off and land over the heads of people. And then obviously there was the requirement that they basically used the whole territory. They made that a special use zone. It was then actually basically transferred to the trade fair company, and they actually had to put up security staff, and they had to make sure that people are not in the takeoff and landing areas. And then we are not really talking about little things. We have to really be very systematic. We had 3 sessions, a very, very complicated kind of trade fair that we organized using a risk assessment that was basically developed in professional football, because all risk can be allocated to that. I think I've actually added another cheat, and you can see that here. High pressure in the halls, high pressure in terms of evacuations, then flow of visitors and coalition and evacuation, then the critical contents in terms of events. So when you're green, it's fine. If it's yellow or red, you might want to take some measures that are suitable to provide necessary security and safety from the perspective of the authorities and from your own perspective. And that is what you need to discuss later on again. So safety and security concepts for the future will always go into that direction. So you want to be very clustered. You want to be very organized in terms of checklists, in terms of risks that are at hand. Because if you have 20 or 30 pages on individual points, you're just going to lose track of what is really mattering. And maybe just one little example. I did the Hansa-Tag. I talked to the mayor. I talked to the representatives of the internal order office, and they were saying, okay, we block the squares when it's overcrowded. And then I said, what is overcrowded? And then we had the first kind of thing. So when is a square too full? A public square, a public marketplace. And then we took a look at, town festivities, and I'm asking them, how many people you have per square meter now? And then, the two people per square meter, they talked about that, these are basically anchored also in the Assembly Act. And then I actually put up a 4-meter kind of barrier, the shape. Okay, the mayor, he was quite a strong man. And then I asked the lady from the internal office order, and then I asked the guy from the building supervision order. And then we were actually standing up there, and then we didn't even touch each other. We weren't even close to that. And then I said, okay, look at this again. So that is a local festivity. So when is it going to be too full? So and who says it is too full? And if you really probe again and again in terms of risk assessments and security and safety concepts, it's all very much schematic. And then you really have to reflect on that. Do you have escape routes that are wide enough? In a panic situation, do you have enough space for people to go out? If you have like 4 or 5 people on the square meter, you remember the Love Parade, we had up to 8 people per square meter, 6 to 8, and that is very, very tight. But you just check in an elevator in a hotel, you just make sure, how many people fit in on these 1 or 2 square meters. It's quite interesting to see. So you want to reflect on that. Flash mob, that is something that I put up here as well. I was at the book fair, not here in Frankfurt, but in a different place, 1,500 people. They basically came down within a minute and a half, and they no longer moved. That was so-called mungus. And the other audience groups were kind of quite upset by aren't these people moving anymore, and that is something that might actually cause some friction. So that is basically something that we might actually see in the Premier League here in Germany starting 2014. That is pyrotechnical elements and 3 days before the event and other things. So it's all these issues that we see in football, but always coming back to audience-related risks, weather-related risks, and other risks. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be glad to answer questions. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, dear colleague Löhr. Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Really exciting to see what is happening in terms of security issues at trade fairs. I think we've covered our presentations. Obviously, now you have the opportunity to ask questions. And I would like to point out again that at 5 o'clock, we will be able to welcome Mr. Löhr on our expert panel, and then we'll talk about general aspects. Again, we're going to be talking about dangers, about risks in terms of chronological developments, what is changing. And then I'd also like to shed some light on the future, possibly to actually forecast what is going to happen in the future. And I'd like to point out this is what we see at the moment. That is what we might want to prepare for, and that is something that might actually happen in the future. Now, however, I would like to come back to the presentation of Mr. Löhr. Other questions from the audience? In the beginning, you pointed out the aspect of the guest organizer, and then you were saying that actually needs to be contractually organized. And then you didn't really touch upon that again. So, however, that is a very interesting issue for me. Because basically we're saying that your own event managers are still basically reliable. They are still liable also and still share responsibility. And you also mentioned that there is that obligation for random checks, in terms of stands. And that obligation apparently remains intact. So what about a guest organizer? What about a guest organizer that rents your whole space and I give you so and so many millions, so leave my exhibitors alone? And then I think the organization and the discussion will obviously be a bit touchy. Well, what I think, it doesn't necessarily need to be true. So you also have to check on the exhibitors of a guest operator. So if you see that they don't really comply with the necessary width of escape routes, so you might want to interfere because you still actually have that guarantor position. You remember the second or third chart. So you still have to guarantee the security. So basically you can transfer your intervention rights to the operator, and you do that in writing also. However, obviously the operator doesn't want to upset his very good customer, so he says, all right, that is fine. But if the operator then decides that is no longer correct, that is a security risk, that he is actually required to act, and there is a verdict coming from Koblenz, from the court there, and there is the ruling that if you don't really maintain that right to intervene, and that was really about a tinnitus case, then he basically liable for the whole thing. Obviously, if it was quite obvious that there was a security risk. So you can't really say, okay, you are a big guest organizer, so you can't really assume that I actually get to transfer the whole rights to rule in that building, because obviously it's different in public companies. That it is really about the domiciliary right, because you want to make sure that the public company act is a bit different, but all the others are saying, well, we actually transfer the domiciliary right as required to safely run your organization. However, if you don't play by the rules, then we actually reserve the right to intervene, and we might electrically check all stands, because we think that is quite a big risk, especially when it is about a lot of circuits and sub-circuits, etc. So we at least take a look at the electrical circuits, or service partners doing that. Or if you have a lot of liftings and ceilings, then you might actually have a static engineer to do your calculations in terms of statics, because if that comes down, you have a big problem. Does that answer your question? Are there more questions? Well, the other day, a client who is the operator of a conference venue. And he approached me. It is always about visitor safety. And in that very concrete case, it was about a technical service provider that was, again, a subcontractor of production without protective clothing. And obviously, I caught him climbing without the protective clothing, and the operator was saying, oh, we are not responsible for the service providers. We are only responsible for our own visitors, for our own audience. And I just wanted to get your opinion on that. So could I copy something somewhere? So you didn't find it quite clear. I don't find it quite clear either, because, well, you have that guarantor position. So you're the operator of a trade fair hall. So you basically have to take care of your own staff. So you're reliable for the safety of your own staff. For your own staff, that is fine. So there's somebody that is cleaning the window, and he has no security latch. He's trying to clean the window. It's not my staff. It might be the staff of one of my service providers. Do I need to interfere? Do I have to get that person down? I have to get over there. If my people walk below that person, if that person could fall down on him. But apart from that, that service provider is responsible to make sure that his people are safe doing their jobs. There's no guarantor position saying like, saying, okay, you just want to make sure that they cross the road. So that is happening all the time. There's violation of rights all the time. The question is always, do you play that guarantor role? Okay, that is all right. That is the road just in front of your venue. But what if it happens inside your hall? Well, that person that went up there climbing, has that person been instructed from the service providers that they need some protective clothing? So they need to be instructed. So if that person nevertheless goes there, then that is his personal issue. So as the fair trade, you have to say, okay, there is this kind of third party that is climbing up there, then I'm responsible for that because it's a third party that I recruited. So I have to make sure who is allowed to go up there and what safety nets are in place. However, if there is an exhibitor at a stand setting something up with his technical service provider, it's never a liability issue if they are up there at 2 levels and if they drop a hammer and that somehow kills the person below him. So I think it's quite likely that I have no issue with that. I also have no operator issue. I have no organizer issue. It is just an issue for the stand operator itself. Well, are there more questions? Just one remark. One colleague always said, if the stand falls basically to the inside, it is a big problem if it falls to the outside, and it's a problem because then it would actually touch upon pedestrian zones, and that is exactly what Mr. Lieber said. Saying about stand security, we've been hearing about that. So the big trade fair companies, they now have that kind of wind replacement or space area. So now sometimes we've got the feeling it's, if you do your calculations statically, and that would actually lead to a lot of steel being used, and we would actually be transporting a lot of steel. And if you wanted to calculate all of that, the statical issues, I think costs would be so high. And then that would be very far. I'm sorry, I'm not a technician. I couldn't really talk about loads and the steel loads, and I'm just a lawyer. I was sitting on a couple of working groups, and then there was also some engineers on that, and they were talking about that, and they were talking about the different loads at trade fairs and the numbers that are usually being mentioned. That is something that you have to believe in as a lawyer. Obviously, it is up to you to question that kind of number, and I would actually use your associations to ask about the appropriateness of these numbers, but I would assume that the trade fair companies would assume the right numbers. I'm sorry, that can't be more helpful. Any more questions? So you have the solution with the whiskers at this trade fair. Peter Neher from AUMA. So we are organizing these working groups that were just mentioned by Mr. Löhr. And I was just going to say There is the Association of Life Communication. I think you're all a member of that. That is also a member of that working group. And we really have 2 sessions a year, and we really talk about what is useful in terms of technical involvement. What we've been talking about here, it might actually give you the idea that it's all topsy-turvy at our affairs. You know, we have a lot of 200,000 exhibitors at German trade fairs, and then you know that there's only a handful of cases happening. And then once we had this issue where actually the wind was coming in, there was only a separating wall. There was also nobody injured, and the technicians, the engineers, they're also here. They meet twice a year in order to make sure that it's still all affordable. And obviously it all does cost money. So if you want to prevent things from happening, or if you actually have to, repair things, I did hear, all these things, what you've been hearing, that it's all going topsy-turvy. I hope that that is not the impression that I gave you. That has never been my intention, but obviously you were saying quite correctly that he's not the lawyer that things actually arrive at. So I usually get live information. There is a couple of issues, but that problem is usually solved. It's also being addressed in the working group. Maybe wrong numbers are being arrived. We all know we're all human. We might actually all make mistakes, but do use your associations to ask about that. Questions? That doesn't seem to be the case, or yes, or there is still one. Well, at the moment, there's a couple of efforts to basically extend the Assembly Act, and it was very hard to basically get that up and to implement that in the federal states. So what other developments do you actually have, and what is happening? What do the operators need to prepare for? Do I still have a minute? Then I answer that one.
Tomorrow there will be a press conference with DPA, and tonight there will be a live transmission of this press conference on the developments on the regulations and ordinances governing assembly places. Well, we wanted to actually include this and pick this up in tonight's discussion. Would you kindly wait for another 10 minutes, because this is truly exciting. There are so many things going on at the legislative level. The Love Parade disaster has had its repercussions also at the legislative level. And of course, I want you to retain your interest in the expert panel. So let's wait for another 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and please join our expert panel where we're going to discuss it. Okay, so now we are going to rearrange the stage setting. Thank you very much, Mr. Löhr. Thank you very much for your presentation, and see you in a few minutes.